A brief history of Mahad Al Islami. An Islamic school in Assab. For over half of a century, the Islamic school in Assab has been the bedrock of Afar education and a fixture of Afar self-sufficiency. The school was not particularly large, nor did it have the capacity to address all the educational needs of the Afar community. But it was unique in the sense this was one of the first Afar-driven initiatives for self-education and empowerment to address the need of the community. The setting up of the foundation for Afar education was an especially proud moment for those who had the vision to emancipate the Afar people economically, socially, politically and spiritually. Those Afar traditional elders have seen what it meant to be colonized and had a vision that an Afar child is as important as any other child and, if given the chance, had the potential to be a successful and productive leader of their respective community. Education in Eritrea during the 1960s was reserved for the privileged few, and it was particularly difficult for Afar families to send their children to school. It was also the time when nation-states in Africa emerge from their colonial past and begin their path towards development. With an end to the Italian and British rule, the Afar nation of Denkalia now controlled the autonomous function of Danakalia. From the tip of Massawa to the tip of Djibouti borders near Raheda, the coastline towns and villages were flourishing with indigenous fishing communities. The Afar also enjoyed reciprocal trade relationships with neighboring nations in the region like Ethiopia and Djibouti, and unhindered access across the Red Sea with Arabian countries like Yemen and Saudi Arabia. One of those thriving indigenous economies has been the indigenous salt mining economy in Makaka town near Assab. The Afar salt mining economy and its leadership made sure the education system by the Afar for the Afar needs to be part of their successful business initiative. They realized the Afar families from the rural Denkalia could not get access to education as in another part of the country, so they established education programs, boarding school and Islamic centers. Two of the signature of the achievements the education programs established by the Afar business leadership from Makaka was the establishment of Dakalia boarding school in Assab. This boarding school hosted underprivileged Afar youth throughout Denkalia and beyond. Through the Assab boarding school programs, the student education, food and even uniforms were funded by the Afar entrepreneurs. For decades, hundreds of Afar students were able to graduate and be productive members of their societies. The other significant achievement made by the Afar business leadership was its contribution to building one of the first Islamic schools in Assab. The Mahad A-dini Al Islami was built in 1970 by traditional Afar leadership. Throughout the years, these Afar traditional elders made sure a percentage of profit on every bag of salt sold was put aside to address the needs of Afar students in the country. Some of these profits even went to support students in Al-Hodeida, in Yemen, to cover the cost of Afar student there. These Afar elders were unique visionaries of their time. Unfortunately, with the independence of Eritrea in 1991, the Afar businesses were confiscated and the autonomous functions of Afar were taken away by the Eritrean regime. Tens of thousands of Afar, including those young Afar student generations, have either fled the country or imprisoned without a trace. Following a series of United Nations investigations, the Eritrean regime has been found guilty of ethnic persecution and crimes against humanity against the Afar in Eritrea. As part of its ethnic cleansing and persecution programs to remove the Afar from strategic coastal towns and villages of Denkalia, the Eritrea regime has deliberately destroyed not only the Afar economic backbone and self-sufficiency but also systematically destroyed the Afar customary law and the Afar traditional leadership.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أوكر الجابوة هنمي جابها الشعبية نكنا نيكي ديني كي عادك مدرك تكاي ويسر مدرك منوت أدو الله تمين كتك هاي تحساكو إن كنا نفهم قف هاي كنا نكي أو اللي حبوه عصب لقيتي ما هنيهن معهد الدين الإسلامي لاستهم معهد أدايا ألفي سغلبول كي مرحية طبعا فكي مهني ألف اختميته هي أنا محيانا متابعيه أفاقوا معهد فكي مهنمي ألفي سغلبول كي مرحية طبعا اختنيه عفر كافكتي وعدي ملاك كافكتي اختنيه محايو ليني كافكيني نهنكي يبليني هنمي عادة كي ديني كي كالتشر وررايا دقات دور تاكن فيماته هنيتنيهي تو بريتو ميغا علاماتو كنيه بريتو كهتني تنمي أمرينم كاري ريمانو كنيه أمرينها فقتنيه ويسرها بريسان كادو مرختنيه تو يسا أكو كين سويهنيهن عادة كي كالتشر ورراكا كوسيتونو ملك جواك بسم مع حدقتنيه تو عدي بريتو عرفها الدبنو عرفها ولا بنو وزيادها كادو ديني بريتو الدحين يا مختليه أما حدك ما نقمري أما هذا اليوم الريه ما نقمري أساكو برك ده تنتني ربتنتني أما هذا نمي تو حاجدي كلا لها ما نقول ده معنا أو إنه متى منك حتى وكم مزان سكوريو وقرس سكول سكويهم لوكي أما هذا سكويهم رينكين المنا معنا هاي ولا نارجمي سنك نال دقنها مروكي دقومو حتى عفرف كنو يا جبدا بين اللي هم عمدان تسوينيه تو عصا تسويهم عفر عمدان تكنو أنا هاي تو عدي توهم دماغتني صار درجي متيه ما درجي ما نقول له كلمة ما نقول كده من لوكين كما درجي دقوم ديني عادة فونو ديني عادة أنا ويكو هذا لي هواي أنا كوهشكليو أنا كوهذا اللي تو أسوي كوابي أنا مرح مسكنا أنا هاي تو سنة بانتوه جبهة الشعبية وتما أنا كوهذا ليو أفا عادة دي نكو هذا ليو هوي أنا كل شكلنا نلقى أنا ما سنو مقادو كنا نلقسوين سنو ميموركية يعني فرام أنا تو تنمي تويا يبقى جالس أقول لك نسوق مع هذا ومع هذا القادو قدم الدهانة كوسا وعفر بحلق مناي ما الدور كلك متكيه مناي ما كعكي ما حبارك معنا هلا سلفوك تنم أنا نيه المقادو برسين هلا سوقي هارجه ما كعكي ما حبار هلا سلفوك مع هذا فردين ما تعمل تترسه هي لا وداخلي القادو ما كعكي ما حبارك القادو حيوك تنمي فأنا شال هلا سلفوك تنم ما كعكي ما حبارك تنيه تترسه هو ما حبار قادو يمكن هلا قوقلت إذن داخلية كيس كل عارفناها حيوصل معنا تو أفرق مدرو متككان ساق تنهي أو عجبها الشعبية حتاها مكون كنا للصنع عادة للصنع دين للصنع نام قطع عقدها وتاما يتصدنا هاي يروب صدنا هدل صدنا أو يهين ما يفوح فاسدنا إن كده كاد جبها الشعبية كسسنا حاكم قراه شعبي كي أيونتك إناني رعتن كادو كن كسسنا هاي وصلنا بيمتكين هلو مليه كل قرأت ما حسليه هوارت ويتمهنم دي قسنا هاي توقت عسيدي والسلام عليكم.
On May 11, 2021, 2 days prior to Eid-ul-Fitr, the Eritrean regime has dealt the final blow to the Afar private education program in Dankalia by closing the door of the historic Mahad A-dini Al Islami Islamic School in Assab. The school staffs were told to go home without any further explanation. These atrocious and brazen actions of the Eritrean government is the final chapter of a series of human rights violations and the end of educational aspiration for the Afar nation of Eritrea.
It is remarkable how the Eritrean state calls itself a self-reliant and self-sufficient nation, and yet asymmetrically opposed to citizens' right to practice self-sufficiency that it professes, with a very little respect and space for those who want to do for themselves in a country. Here you have an example in the Afar people, an indigenous nation with its long established history and autonomy in this region, people with an expertise to utilize their traditional territory, their God-given right to feed themselves from their traditional natural resources, such as salt, indigenous fishing, with a history of cross-border trading, with building their communities and engaging with nations and nationalities throughout this region, never needing any handout from any colonial powers, including from the current Eritrean regime. And then you have here one of the worst repressive states in the world, a hypocritical military tyrant, which preaches self-sufficiency but practically destroys any opportunity for economic freedom for its people, subjugating them into hunger and poverty. The Eritrean state is deliberately destroying the Afar economic way of life by crippling policies of militarization and economic subjugation through violence and its illegal embargo on the freedom of movement of the Afar people. The Eritrean regime, in its 30 years of existence, have failed to build a single institution for educating the Afar people in Assab, and now, driven by its atrocious inhumanity to force the closure of a tiny privately owned Afar school in Assab. The world is watching you, Eritrea.